Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I was gonna do a video on the breakdancing competition in the Olympics, but I'll do that a little bit later. Right now, we have sad news to report in the world of professional wrestling, and that is the death of Kevin Sullivan. Yes, Kevin Sullivan, the Taskmaster Kevin Sullivan. And as you can see in the headline, he was the Prince of Darkness in professional wrestling, the first to introduce the occult to professional wrestling ever. Well, let's get into the career of Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan was born in Boston, Massachusetts, where he started up in 1949, where he started out, as an amateur wrestler. I guess at that time he was living in the Boston area, so Boston is a tremendously important professional wrestling town. It has had professional wrestling going back to like the 1920s and 30s, even with Paul Bowser and later Tony Santos. And then when Vince McMahon Sr. took over that city, it became part of the WWF circuit. So he got interested in wrestling there, but he broke into the ranks initially in amateur wrestling, not really professional wrestling. And you know, he really wanted to break into professional wrestling because that's what he was a fan of. So 2 years amateur wrestling, and then finally he goes down to Florida, Florida would be his home, and he goes to Coast Wrestling. At that time, this was in the early 70s. He breaks into the business in 1971. The Fullers, Ron and Don Fuller, um, many people will know Ron Fuller as Colonel Rob Parker. They're in charge of all the territories from Montgomery, Alabama to Pensacola, northern Florida, that section of Florida, and Eddie Graham is in charge in the lower part of Florida. So he starts off with them, and he starts off as Johnny West. Now, as Johnny West, he's kind of an enhancement guy, doesn't really do anything, kind of a journeyman wrestler for most of his early career. He even has a couple of stints in the WWF in the mid 70s. There he wrestles, Ray Sanchez. Again, nothing really that big. But it's not till the early 1980s, 1982, when he comes down. He's been wrestling for a decade already. When he comes down to Eddie Graham's territory, when he really makes his home. Eddie Graham's territory is like Tampa, Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, the Bahamas, Cuba, even, well, not in Kevin Sullivan's time, when he was there, but before 1959, Eddie Graham even promoted cards in Cuba, the Bahamas, Miami, of course, based out of the Tampa Sportatorium. Now, when Sullivan was a journeyman in the mid 70s, he went to Eddie Graham's mentor, Roy Shire, in San Francisco. But like I'm saying, Eddie Graham was known as a real genius in professional wrestling. Other promoters from other territories, went to Eddie Graham for finishes, for ideas. Eddie Graham learned from Roy Shire, but he also learned from Terry Funk's father, Dory Funk Sr., when Eddie Graham himself was wrestling in the Amarillo territory in Texas. So Sullivan, and this is important in the Sullivan story because Sullivan, as he's wrestling in Florida, he absorbs the booking genius of Eddie Graham, and he himself will carry that on to become a booker later in his career. So he's still a babyface. He's teaming with Steve Keirn. But when he and Steve Keirn lose, their chance at the Florida the championship from championship uh, wrestling from Florida tag team titles, he turns on Steve Keirn, and this is when his persona becomes what his persona becomes. He turns heel, and and it was during this time there was something called the Satanic Panic, because it all kicked off in 1983, um, where this daycare, the managers of this daycare in California, the Mick Martins, were indicted on charges of child abuse, and the child abuse, um, was sodomy, and it was also claimed that these children were abused, and forced to perform all kinds of occultic rituals, and worship the devil. And also at this time, heavy metal music was very popular on the radio. And a lot of like conservatives were saying that enthusiasts of heavy metal music and players of games like Dungeons and Dragons were worshiping the devil. So Sullivan hears this, and Sullivan decides, you know what, I'm going to make my persona somebody who worships the devil, right? A devil worshiper. And that's just what it becomes. He shoots these incredible promos on the beach, with him and Maniac Mark Lewin. He forms Sullivan's Army of Darkness, this faction where Mark Lewin they call Purple Haze, right? Mark Lewin is coming out of the water in a haze of all purple, right, as a demon, and Sullivan is doing seances summoning him, right? So like, here Sullivan is in one of the most conservative states at the time, and even still today, in the United States, in Florida, walking around talking about he worships the devil. And this is a kayfabe era. This isn't like today where we'll just say, oh, well, he's just a fake wrestler, right? He doesn't really worship the devil. That's not really what he does. No, back then they believed, you know what I mean? And they couldn't wait to see the baby faces like Barry Windham, like Blackjack Mulligan, like um, Dusty Rhodes, especially when Dusty became big in the mid '70s in Florida, kick Sullivan's ass because Sullivan, uh, you know, Sullivan is so evil, right? This was the early '80s, so Dusty was already a babyface, but Sullivan was so evil, right? He had this storyline, this incredible storyline with Luna Vachon. Now, Luna Vachon, we talked a lot about her on this channel, right? Um, Extensively about her, specifically her time in the WWF, right? But when she first broke into the business, she came in as a reporter, right? A mild-mannered reporter, um, interviewing, not interviewing, presenting Blackjack Mulligan with an award. She's presenting him with this award on behalf of like Pro Wrestling Illustrated, I think it was. Uh, right? And what does Kevin Sullivan do? Kevin Sullivan gets a hold of her. Wait, let me see. Hold on, guys. Let me see. Okay, guys, it wasn't. Blackjack Mulligan. My mistake. It was Kendall Windham, his son, with the award, right? And she and her stage name at the time was Trudy Heard. So she's the Mile Manor reporter, Trudy Heard, and then Blackjack Mulligan is beside her, beside his son, right? And he calls out Kevin. Kevin Sullivan's army comes out, and he slaps the face of Luna, right? And all of a sudden now, the cult, Sullivan's army, have taken control of Luna, right? And they shave the side of her head, and now Luna is under their spell, and Luna is just as crazy as they are. So Gertrude Heard, has turned into Luna Vachon. Luna, the Luna in her name doesn't stand for the Spanish word for the moon. It's short for lunatic, right? And she became the Luna we all know and love. This storyline played out so well because if you watch these vignettes where they have Luna as a hostage and they're transforming her psychologically, you'd be like, oh my God, this is some scary shit. And it was scary, man. Like it really, really was. And then you had the fallen angel, Nancy Sullivan, as his manager, who later became his real life wife. We'll talk about it as the video goes on. And Kevin Sullivan was the top heel in the company. He talked about how he would go to places like Miami, and they would want to, and the Haitians that would go to the matches, they would want to kill him. Or he was in the Bahamas wrestling, and he would fight against the local Bahamian stars over there, and they would want to kill him there. You know what I mean? He had to make up a lie that he was a Cockney John. What is a Cockney John? A white Bahamian. You know what I mean? Despite his heavy Boston accent. You know what I mean? Because they want to, the fans were passionate, especially when it came to this, because of what he was doing, the nature of his character. So he stays in championship wrestling from Florida until like the mid '80s, and then he goes to Jim Crockett Promotions. And in Jim Crockett Promotions, he forms the Varsity Club. Again, another faction where he has these guys under control. Mike Rotunda is there. Rick Steiner also there. Rick Steiner at this time was a mute, right? He was just going around barking like a dog. And then I'll get to another faction later on that Sullivan forms with Buzz Sawyer and Cactus Jack in the late '80s, where there's this promo that Buzz Sawyer is doing with Sullivan, and Buzz Sawyer is barking like a dog, roof, 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 at the end of the match because he has a chain. He's choking his opponent. It's a regular jobber match, right? He's choking his opponent with a chain, and nobody can get Buzz Sawyer off. He's growling like a rabid dog, but only Sullivan can control him. So after the match, they're doing the interview with Jim Ross and Cactus Jack, and Sullivan is slapping Buzz Sawyer, and he goes, "It's me, it's me, it's me!" Like you would a dog that's out of control. It's me, it's me, it's me. He's slapping him. So it's just funny, I was sick last year, and I came across it for the first time ever because, again, I wasn't watching the NWA in '89, so I never saw that. And even though I was sick as a dog last year, watching it, it made me laugh because of how good, first of all, Buzz Sawyer's mannerisms were, acting like the dog, and how much restraint it must have took for Mick Foley and Jim Ross not to bust out laughing every time he goes, "It's me, it's me, it's me, it's me," and, and Buzz Sawyer's scratching at him like a dog. Crazy, funny shit. So he's there until the late. He's in Jim Crockett Promotions until the late 1980s. And finally, he's a good friend of Jim Cornette's. So Jim Cornette is starting up Smoky Mountain Wrestling. So he goes down there and he works a couple of programs with like Primetime Brian Lee, The Undertaker, aka Chains from DOA, and he's there for a while until Paul Heyman also opens up a wrestling company around that time, and Sullivan, that's when he's teams with Taz. He has one night when he's teaming with Taz, and he's taking on the original Sheik and Road Warrior Hawk, and he's there for like a year. He also wrestles that night. Him and Taz wrestled the night the line was crossed. The time they had the first triple threat match in all of wrestling history between Shane Douglas, Terry Funk, and Sabu. At one time, I said that it took place in 1995, and it was between Shane Douglas, Sabu, and Taz. That's not true. It's Shane Douglas, Terry Funk, and Sabu. And Sullivan was on the card that night. Woman had also come back, and Woman was now in Sullivan's corner and later in the Sandman's corner in ECW. He was very instrumental in ECW. But in 1994, this is where I know Kevin from. Where I first was introduced to him because, again, I didn't watch Florida Championship Wrestling. I didn't even watch the original NWA. And he comes back to WCW. It's under new management. Eric Bischoff is in charge. Dusty is kind of stepping down, so they want a new booker, right? So they call Sullivan. Sullivan was the booker even on the committee when Ric Flair was the booker in '89 in WCW, but like I said, he went elsewhere. And he comes in as this wrestler, the Equalizer, right? The Equalizer in the beginning was like, he was like a berserker, like WCW's version of John Nord, the Berserker. He was that, he was, hairy boots, Viking, whatever, right? Type costume. But he was getting bullied in promos by the Nasty Boys. So he tells the Nasty Boys, next week on WCW Pro, I'm going to bring out my big brother. Now, people are like, his big brother, who's he talking about? And he does bring out Kevin Sullivan. Now, they do look alike. Like these two performers, the guy that played Dave Sullivan and Kevin Sullivan, looked like they could be actual brothers. I mean, really, they did. And, they start the feud with the Nasty Boys. Later on, Cactus Jack gets into the feud because after Max Payne leaves WCW, Cactus Jack no longer has a tag team partner, so him and Kevin Sullivan begin to team up. And they have the Broad Street Bully match with Dave Schultz, the hockey player, as the referee at Slamboree '94. And this is a wild match because, again, like I said before in the 1994 year in review video, WWF never did matches like this. WWF never had matches, and it took place in Philadelphia because Dave Schultz, the hockey player, he played for the Flyers, right? So Philadelphia, of course, ECW is up and running. Kevin Sullivan's from ECW. Cactus Jack has been in ECW. Well, I don't think Cactus has been in ECW yet. We'll get to the controversy surrounding him being in ECW, but anyway, it's a wild match, just like the Spring Stampede match with the month before with Max Payne and the Nasty Boys. It's a wild ass match, and I loved it, man. I love the Broad Street Bully match from Slamboree '94. It's definitely give it a look. It was wild and crazy, and Kevin Sullivan and Cactus Jack win the tag team championships. Now, at the same time, ECW and WCW kind of have a working relationship with each other. There are WCW wrestlers that appear on ECW. Beautiful Bobby Eaton, Arn Anderson appeared on ECW once in a while. Road Warrior Hawk, as we spoke about, appeared on ECW once in a while. But ECW has a show, not a pay-per-view, just a regular show called When Worlds Collide. Now, in '94, and they consider that their trademark. But then WCW has a show with them and AAA called When Worlds Collide. So now, um, ECW is like, wait a minute, we have this trademark. Why are you stealing our trademarks? So they take WCW to court for copyright infringement. Anyway, the way this gets settled out is that contracted WCW wrestlers like Kevin Sullivan now have to appear, and Cactus Jack now have to appear on ECW, and that's what they do. Cactus takes it a little bit too far and spits on the belt, and Ric Flair, who's booking at the time for WCW, he doesn't like this. You know what I mean? He considers this totally disrespect. How are you going to spit on the belt like that? So the idea is like, okay, Cactus Jack is now leaving WCW for ECW. And so is Kevin Sullivan after this, right? So they have in September of that year, Fall Brawl, they have a loser leaves town match, and Cactus Jack retires, from WCW and just goes to ECW. He wouldn't last there long, but he did have classic feuds like Tommy Dreamer, especially a little bit with Sabu, and then he would be on his merry way to the World Wrestling Federation to become Mankind, and the rest is history. But Cactus and Sullivan have that history. So it's now 1990. We're going into the late of 1994. Sullivan now, Hulk Hogan has come to the WWF. And in kayfabe, the guy that used to be the hero to Dave Sullivan, the guy that he called on when the Nasty Boys were picking on him, was his brother, right? And that's like, he's like the mascot of the Cactus Jack and Kevin Sullivan team, is when they're tag team champions, right? But now Hulk Hogan is coming in. Now Dave Sullivan has become infatuated with Hulk Hogan. He's wearing the red and yellow. He's doing the ear thing, but he's doing it backwards like this instead of like this, like how it is, because he's dyslexic. That's his character, right? So Kevin Sullivan gets aggravated at this, upset about this. He says, that's my brother. You're trying to steal my brother away and stuff. So I'm going to make your life a living hell, Hulk Hogan. And he forms the three faces of fear. He says, you're going to turn my brother against me. I'm going to turn your brother against you. And he orchestrates an attack on Hogan's leg at Clash of the Champions right before Hogan is set to defend the WCW Championship against Brutus the Barber Ric Flair by an unknown masked man. And turns out Hogan at Halloween Havoc 95, after retiring Flair, Hogan finds out, hey, the masked man is Brutus, right? Brother Brutai, they were calling him. They couldn't call him Brutus the Barber Beefcake because that's WWF trademark. So they have so now they call Ed Leslie the Butcher, and the John Tenta comes in, and so John Tenta, Kevin Sullivan, and Ed Leslie are the three faces of fear. And at Starrcade, they plan to steal the WCW title from Hulk Hogan. And that's when Macho Man appears, saying that he'll either shake Hulk Hogan's hand or slap him in the face. And he ends up helping Hulk Hogan with the three faces of fear. Anyway, and then they have a tag team match the following month at Clash of Champions with the three faces of fear. But this three faces of fear concept lasts, a little while until, Kevin Sullivan gets a little into 1995. And so Kevin Sullivan gets upset at Brutus the Barber Beefcake for not being able to defeat Hulk Hogan and bring the title home. So he figures he needs to amp it up. So he dumps Brutus the Barber Beefcake. The Brutus Beefcake then becomes the Man with No Name, and they have a little stupid match at Slamboree 95. And at the end of the match, Sullivan hears a voice. And you can hear the voice, Sullivan, my son! Sullivan, my son! Right? And it's like, who is this calling Kevin Sullivan their son? I didn't know it at the time because I didn't know anything about professional wrestling in Hawaii or anywhere. But it's the legend, King Curtis Iokea. The most famous wrestler in the Hawaiian territory. He's now the master, and Kevin Sullivan is the taskmaster. Now Kevin Sullivan is dressing up literally like the iconography says the devil looks like. This little short man, short stature, dressing up like this, and the master, Curtis Iokea, says, now you're going to form the Dungeon of Doom. And in the August Clash of Champions, um, they lure before Hogan's match with Vader. They lure Hogan into this dungeon, and it's one of the most cartooniest things you'll ever see in professional wrestling. He's a water's coming down in this dungeon, and Hogan touches it and he goes, "It's not hot." But anyway, they lure him into the dungeon, and a bunch of oddity wrestlers. John Tenta now is the Shark. Ed Leslie's back in the fold as the Zodiac, which was a character from Mr. Nanny that they decided to bring back. Kamala's there. All these oddity wrestlers beating up on Hulk Hogan. And then the Giant comes out. The Giant at this time, for like 2 or 3 months, had been stalking Hulk Hogan. He was presenting a Harley Davidson at the pre-show to Bash at the Beach to this Make-A-Wish kid, and he threw what was supposed to be Andre the Giant's shirt at Hogan. And Hogan got shocked. He's been around. WCW. Obviously, it's Paul White, the guy who would become the Giant in WCW. So Sullivan introduces him. So Sullivan has his evil stable. But unlike Sullivan's Army of Darkness, or unlike the Varsity Club, back in the 80s, this stable is not intimidating at all. These are a bunch of losers and jabronis. But this is what Hogan wants. Hogan, he already beat Ric Flair a lot of times. He beat Vader a lot of times. Rick Rude wasn't even there yet. He was injured in May of '94. So, but even if Rick Rude was still a top guy in WCW, he didn't want to work with Hogan. You know what I mean? So Hogan didn't really have anybody to work with. So Sullivan said he'll work with him with this Dungeon of Doom concept. So in Hogan's first War Games, he, Sting, the Macho Man, it was supposed to be Vader, but Vader had that knockout incident with Paul Orndorff. They come together. Lex Luger jumps from WWF to WCW back to WCW, and he's the fourth War Games guy. These four baby faces take on members of the Dungeon of Doom. John Tenta, the Shark, Zodiac, Kamala, and Ming. And the stipulation is that if the baby faces win, Hogan gets time alone with Kevin Sullivan. The baby faces do win, right? But the Giant comes out and breaks Hogan's neck, so he doesn't get the time alone with Sullivan. But the feud with Sullivan continues because Sullivan, in his own words, is on a quest to destroy Hogan. He's like, I'm gonna destroy you, Hogan, and he's wearing Hogan's colors. His robe is red and yellow, and that's his mission. He wants to destroy Hulk Hogan to the point that one time on Nitro, he knocks Hogan out. He shaves his mustache, and he takes Hogan's colors. And Hogan, right before the Halloween Havoc match with the Giant, comes out in all black. Right? He's like an evil Hulk Hogan, right? So, and it's funny because just yesterday, just before this news about Kevin Sullivan came out, I saw the Chris Van Vliet interview with Hogan, and they asked him, when was the last time you shaved your mustache? And Hogan lied and said it was during the feud with Kevin Sullivan. And actually, right before Halloween Havoc 96 the next year in the match against Randy Savage as Hollywood Hogan. But yeah, his mustache does get shaved here, and he looks really weird as Black Hogan, you know, like uh, preparing for this. And the lead ups, the nitros and the lead ups to Halloween Havoc '95 were really weird because, like, not only was Sullivan threatening to destroy Hogan, but he was they had this big ice box, you know, in the center of the ring every nitro, and Sullivan would go on about the Yeti is coming, the Yeti is coming, right? So people are like, well, what's the Yeti? Well, we find out at the end of Halloween Havoc '95. The Yeti is Ron Reese. Now, supposedly, it was supposed to be the former Elegante, Elegante in WCW and the Giant Gonzalez in the WWF. But they couldn't come to terms with him or whatever. So it turns out that it's Ron Reese, Big Ron Stud, coming out. But it's not necessarily that. Like, it's a melee, the Giant and Hulk Hogan match, because first of all, they had a monster truck battle in the beginning of the pay-per-view, and the Giant slipped off the roof of Cobo Hall, but 5 minutes later, he comes back. He's not dead. He's still alive, right? He comes back and he wins the championship. And it turns into a melee because Lex Luger comes in. He joins the Dungeon of Doom. He helps the Dungeon of Doom. Randy Savage comes in. He tries to help Hogan. He gets beat up. So Hogan's in a bear hug, right? And the Giant has a bear hug on Hogan. And the Yeti comes out. And you can hear Tony Schiavone go, "Oh my God, it's the Yeti!" And he's not a Yeti. A Yeti is a snow monster. A Yeti is like, you know, a snow creature. The guy that can't, Ron Reese, was a mummy. A mummy. You know, they have their horror icons mixed up. He wasn't a Yeti. He was a mummy. You know, and he's wrapped up in toilet paper. But that's not the funniest part of it. The funniest part of it is he does another bear hug to Hogan from the back. So you got the Giant in Hogan's front, you got the Yeti in Hogan's back, and they're doing a bear hug, and they're swinging him, back and forth, and then it's like you can see Hogan's body go. It looks like, it honestly looked like they were humping Hulk Hogan. You know, you're like double teaming him or whatever. It was terrible. Halloween Havoc '95, man. If you want to laugh your ass off at a pay-per-view, man, there's so much wrestle crap in that. It's just amazing. But anyway, they don't destroy Hogan. Hogan continues on. But finally, they have their final plan, their final solution, if you will. But what did happen on Halloween Havoc '95 was the Horsemen reformed. Ric Flair, after months and months of begging Sting to be his partner against Arn Anderson and Brian Pillman, finally says, you know, okay, I'll be your partner, you know. And Ric Flair turns on him. And Ric Flair and Arn Anderson and Brian Pillman reform the Four Horsemen. Cool, right? But now they hate they grow to hate Randy Savage because, of course, Randy Savage is in a feud with Ric Flair at Starrcade. Randy Savage has won the WCW title that was vacated after the Giant won it because with all the interference, Jimmy Hart turning heel, Lex Luger turning heel, WCW Commissioner Nick Bockwinkel said, no, the title is null and void. We're going to hold it up in a three-ring battle royal, World War III. So the first World War III, '95. Randy for the title, Randy Savage wins it, and now he has to put up the championship for the winner of the triple threat match, Luger, Ric Flair, and Sting. So they have that triple threat match, the first triple threat match in WCW history. And Flair wins it, and he beats his former nemesis, Randy Savage, for Randy Savage's first WCW title. So now the newly formed Horsemen, are in a beef with Randy Savage. Then later on, throughout the year, Miss Elizabeth comes back, right? Uh, she helps the Mega Powers take on the Giant and the Four Horsemen, right? But the Horsemen get her to turn on Hogan, and her to turn on Savage. Like woman, oh woman, is back in the WCW again. You know what I mean? She left ECW, and she came out with Hogan one night, surprisingly, and she turned on Hogan, hit him with a slipper. So now Miss Elizabeth has turned on Randy Savage and hit him with a slipper, costing him the championship. So now the Four Horsemen and the Dungeon of Doom have formed an alliance. The alliance to destroy Hogan, because each one hates Hogan and Randy Savage. So Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan team up at Uncensored 96, and they have two new members of the Dungeon of Doom. One is this big brawly guy, whatever, and they call him the Final Solution. And of course, that name is never going to fly with the Turner execs, because they weren't thinking of the final solution to destroy Hulkamania or the final solution to destroy Hulk Hogan or Randy Savage. Obviously, for anybody that knows anything about world history, the final solution is a reference to Hitler's plan to exterminate the Jewish people. So the Turner execs were not going to have that as a wrestler's name. And the other is Z Gangsta, aka Zeus, aka Debo, who we talked about in the 1989 review from WWF just a couple nights ago. So they have that. It's one of the worst matches ever. Like, it's literally a terrible match. Like, it was supposed to be Brian Pillman in that, but he got kicked out. And here's another thing. As they have this alliance, the alliance between the Horsemen and the Dungeon of Doom begins to break down, because Brian Pillman starts to be really disrespectful to Kevin Sullivan and even to Arn Anderson. And Kevin Sullivan is saying, look, put him in his place or else I'm going to have to beat his ass, right? He's one of your guys. He's a horseman. Put him in his place. So they decide on Super Bowl VI. They decide on a leather strap match between Brian Pillman and Kevin Sullivan. And you can see it in the title. The loser has to tell the other that they respect them, after they lose. I respect you. So what does Brian Pillman do? He's doing the loose cannon gimmick, right? He Clash of Champions, the event before Super Bowl VI, he almost attacked Bobby Heenan, and Bobby Heenan was like, what the fuck is that? Remember in the match with Eddie Guerrero on live TV. So he comes out, and they're having the match with Kevin Sullivan. It's calm for the match with Kevin Sullivan. And before the match could even begin, Brian Pillman blurts out, I respect you, Booker man. Now, a lot of fans are shocked. What does this mean, Booker man? Because I was 12, at the time, 11 going on 12. And I knew a lot about wrestling. I had a lot of wrestling magazines at that time. But again, the magazines I had were after mags. They were kayfabe mags. They went along with the storylines. It wasn't inside news stuff. So I didn't know what is a Booker man. You know what I mean? Obviously, later on, I learned Kevin Sullivan was the booker for WCW. The booker in wrestling is the guy who decides who wins or loses and who writes the storylines. So he broke the fourth wall. He broke kayfabe. I respect you, Booker man. And people are like, man, was this, even some of the wrestlers, retrospectively, they talked about it. They were like, is this real? Like, did he mean for him to say this, or did he just, start going into business for himself, Brian Pillman? We don't know. He later does shit like this when he goes to ECW, because he has this idea that because of his antics, Eric Bischoff will fire him and he'll appear on ECW, but he wants to show a real letter of termination. So he tells Eric Bischoff, listen, fax me an actual letter of termination, and it won't be, I won't sign it. I won't sign it, and I'll come back. I will. Well, he faxes him. Bischoff stupidly faxes him the letter, and then he feels like he doesn't have to go back to WCW. So he goes to ECW, Brian Pillman. And then it's when he makes that famous ECW promo in ECW. He was like, in a city where the Constitution was signed, an executive at WCW is trying to take away my constitutional right. A mark is a guy who spends his last $20 on crack cocaine. A mark is a guy that believes that OJ didn't do it. And he says, I have half a mind to take out my Johnson and piss all over every one of you motherfucking smart marks. Brian Pillman, rest in peace, man. It was a great, great performance. But anyway, going back to Kevin Sullivan. Now Kevin Sullivan, the feud, the Alliance to end Hulkamania, it fails. One of the worst matches ever, uncensored 96. And now Hogan's, going off to make movies. He won't be back until in July. So now, and Brian Pillman's gone. So now who does Kevin Sullivan have to feud with now? Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit was the fourth member of that edition of the Four Horsemen. He was added on WCW Saturday Night without anybody knowing. He just came back from the company. Just came back to the company after being gone for 2 years wrestling in Japan. He was there in '93. He wrestled against Too Cold Scorpio at Super Bowl III. But for 2 years, he was in Japan. He almost was Owen Hart's mystery partner instead of Yokozuna against the Smoking Guns at WrestleMania 11. But he's here in WCW. And they have a match set for the Great American Bash. Now, this match, Falls Count Anywhere match, is a legendary match. This is a thing of legend in professional wrestling. Everybody talks about this. The match, they start off in the ring, but they go to the bathroom. And here they are, fighting in the bathroom, slamming each other into the stalls and everything. Incredible match. Great American Bash in 1996 is an incredible show. So that's the feud. But what's happening next? What's happening now? After Bash of the Beach 96, Chris Benoit beats the hell out of Kevin Sullivan, who comes out to try to stop him, his Horseman teammate, Woman. But many people don't know at this time that Woman is the wife of Kevin Sullivan. Unless you follow Kevin Sullivan's career like in Florida, you wouldn't really know that. Like I didn't. I just think, oh, well, she's a member of the Horsemen. So, and Horsemen and Dungeon and Doom, they have this alliance, Moose Alliance. So that's why she's trying to stop Benoit from beating the shit out of Kevin, right? No. What's happening is that Kevin Sullivan had this idea that she turned on Kevin Sullivan, right? And she starts to have an on-screen love affair with Chris Benoit. And the on-screen love affair with Chris Benoit, unfortunately, it turns into a real-life love affair with Chris Benoit, and she eventually leaves Chris Benoit for Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan worked himself into a shoot. He booked his own divorce, right? So eventually, Nancy Sullivan or Nancy Benoit is in this relationship with Chris Benoit, not just on camera, but in real life too. And this later affects, business in WCW because, okay, now it's the NWO. And Kevin Sullivan is the main one responsible for booking most of the good shit that came out of the NWO. Most of the things we remember from the NWO was shit that Kevin Sullivan broke. Because again, he learned at the learning tree of Eddie Graham. He learned, how what worked in professional wrestling and what didn't work in professional wrestling. And he learned to book heat. He would have the heels go over, and he would have more and more heat each time the heels went over. Maybe so what's going on? Each time they would go over and they would beat up the babyface, and that's just what the NWO needed to make them look strong. A lot of tremendous heat. They needed to get the advantage, and that's just what Kevin Sullivan did. As a matter of fact, the famous Disney MGM segment where the Dungeon of Doom and the Horsemen are having a match, and Jimmy Hart comes out and goes, "Hey, hey, hey!" and there's a commotion backstage, and Rey Mysterio gets lawn darted into the production truck, and people around MGM Studios, they thought it was real, so they're calling the cops, saying there's a gang fight outside on the lot. Meanwhile, it's a wrestling angle, right? Because they don't see wrestlers dressed in wrestling gear. They see guys like the NWO dressed in street clothes. So he booked that. Kevin Sullivan booked that. Hulk Hogan's heel turn. Now, Hogan and Sullivan, they were rivals like last month on camera, but they've known each other for years because Hulk Hogan is from Florida. So when Kevin Sullivan was coming up in Florida, they got to know each other. So Hogan is thinking about turning heel, but he's unsure about it. He doesn't know how this will impact his merchandise sales. He doesn't know if this is a good decision. So it's Kevin Sullivan who has Hogan stay over at his house the night before Bash at the Beach in 1996 to assure him this is a good decision. You're making the right decision, Hulk. And inevitably, Hulk does it, and it becomes one of the most iconic things ever in professional wrestling. And going on, from here, Kevin Sullivan is the one who booked the 83-week run that of WCW. And when it comes to the NWO, let me just say one thing. Everybody wants to take credit for the NWO. There's two things in wrestling that every booker and creative mind wants to take credit for. That's the NWO and the Montreal Screwjob. But only because how they turned out. You know what I mean? Success has many fathers, but failures have no fathers. In other words, when something is good and something is successful, everybody wants to say they invented it. When something is bad, nobody wants to lay claim to it. So those two things fall under that. But when it comes to the NWO, whether or not it was his idea, because we know it was Eric Bischoff's idea, he ripped it off from Japan, right? The UWF angle with New Japan Pro Wrestling. We know that. Even though he denies it, he said he now on his 83 Weeks podcast, he denies that he got anything from Kevin Sullivan. He denies that he got anything from Japan. We all know that Kevin Sullivan was the brainchild behind the NWO, the brainchild behind Hogan turning heel. Because Kevin Sullivan's philosophy was like, they loved Ali, then they hated Ali, then they loved him again. So in order to get the people to love Hogan again, Hogan would have to turn his back on the people. That's what Kevin Sullivan did. And that was true. That turned out to be true. So the 83-week run that WCW had, beating the WWE in the ratings, that was because of Sully. That was solely because of Sully. And Kevin, surrounded himself with his Florida buddies, J.J. Dillon, Dusty Rhodes, and they were the creative geniuses behind, mostly Kevin Sullivan, behind the success of WCW, which you saw in 96, 97, and a lot of 98. Now, people are going to say, because again, success has many fathers and failure is a bastard. People are going to say, well, what about his failures? Later on, as WWF started to gain more steam, and Russo and Ferrara, after the Montreal Screwjob started to catch up with the WWF, it seemed like Kevin was losing steam. And in 1999, they got rid of him to bring in Russo and Ferrara. And of course, Russo and Ferrara fucked it up so badly that they were fired. Now, what happens when they get fired? Russo and Ferrara made it their mission to push the younger guys, right? They wanted to leave behind the Hogans, the Nashes, the Randy Savages, the Ric Flairs, the Goldbergs, the Stings, the DDPs, the established players in WCW. They wanted to push those guys to the side and push Booker T, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Perry Saturn, Shane Douglas, who had just come over from ECW. All these younger guys, right? They wanted to push them to the forefront and put the older guys to the side. That was their big plan, to shake things up in WCW. Well, they do that, and Chris Benoit has a match at Sold Out 2000 with Sid, and Chris Benoit actually wins the WCW championship against Sid. But just as he's the champion, he finds out that they're firing Russo and Ferrara, sending them home, and bringing back Kevin Sullivan. So he's like, you know what? I don't want to work anymore under Kevin Sullivan, because now I'm a top star, and he focuses mainly on the top guys in the promotion, and I fear for what he'll do for my career. He might bury me. Why might he bury me? Because I stole his wife. you know what I mean? I'm the reason for his divorce. So I don't want to work unless they bring Russo and Ferrara back. I don't want to work there. So what do? They walk out. And by they, I mean Perry Saturn, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, and Chris Benoit. It was supposed to be Conan and Shane Douglas, but they burned bridges in the WWF, and they weren't going back. You know what I mean? So they all get in contact with the WWF, and then they appear on WWF TV sitting in the front row. So now the heart of WCW, the gut of WCW, the worker talent of WCW, the in-ring talent of WCW is now ripped out of WCW, and they have nothing to work with. So people that say, oh, well, when Kevin Sullivan came back, what did he book? A Yappa Pie strap match between Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair at Super Bowl 10. But of course he did that, because he didn't have the players anymore. The players left, right? Now, other people that were associates of Kevin Sullivan said that he should have never booked Chris Benoit, but he treated Chris Benoit fairly. Honestly, Chris Benoit became a star under Kevin Sullivan's watch. The Best of 7 series that he had with Booker T in 1998 was booked by Kevin Sullivan. So I don't know what Benoit had fear of. I don't think Sullivan took it personal. You know what I mean? Who knows? Maybe he and woman were going through something and they would have broken up anyway. You know what I'm saying? We don't know that. But that's what Benoit thought. And because of that, the whole mid-card of WCW was gutted out. And it wasn't long after that WCW went under, because they couldn't manufacture newer stars fast enough. Even when they brought Russo and Ferrara back, right, in the middle of the year 2000, it was still not good enough. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to build up other younger guys that didn't leave, like Buff Bagwell and Booker T. It wasn't good enough. I mean, when those guys left, that was it for WCW. And, after WCW, Kevin Sullivan remained on a committee with WCW until it closed its doors in 2001. And many people blamed him. You put too much emphasis on the older guys, or you booked Goldberg's loss, right? But Sullivan's philosophy when it came to Goldberg's loss at Starrcade, he created the streak. Mike Tenay gave him the idea because the streak was already happening. So Kevin Sullivan created the streak, his idea. So, and they made the streak a thing. I think they fucked it up when they started adding fake numbers, because fans who knew, like Goldberg, but the house shows Goldberg was doing, They knew how many matches Goldberg had, so uh, adding numbers on, it's like, okay, now this is bullshit. Like WWE didn't do that with Undertaker. It was, it was what it was, 21-1. You know, the, the streak. When WCW started adding on fake numbers, and like Goldberg's only had this amount of matches on pay-per-view, or this amount of matches on TV, or this amount of matches at house shows. How can his number be up to like 280 something? It didn't make any sense. So that's when it messed up. But Sullivan's philosophy was like, wins and losses don't matter to wrestling fans. You know what I mean? He could still lose and he could still be over. Now, a lot of people disagree with that, because Sullivan was still booking at Starrcade 98. People say Nash was. No, Nash wasn't booking. Kevin Nash wasn't booking until after that. They gave Kevin Sullivan a break, and then Kevin Nash took over the booking duties. Funny story between the two Kevins, Kevin Sullivan and Kevin Nash. There's one Nitro, I think it was around May of 97, right? It was right around the time that Kevin Green was coming in with the six-man tag, Kevin Green teaming with Piper and Flair to take on Six, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash, where Kevin Sullivan actually got into it with a real-life fight with Kevin Nash. And Kevin Nash goes on TV and goes, to all you Napoleons out there who are too short to get on the rise at Disney World, this goes out to you. And which was a subliminal hit at Kevin Sullivan, because obviously Napoleon was short, Kevin Sullivan is short. He was a very short man. So, and later on, after the show was over, he kicked down his door. So, WCW closes doors, and Kevin pretty much lays low. He does a few things here and there at the Indies, and he recently started his podcast. Now, here's another thing I want to get into, and this is time to put this conspiracy theory bullshit to an end. This guy, the Fallen Angel, I think his name was, wait, let me look up his name. His name was Johnny Lee Clary. He was the Fallen Angel in the early days of I guess it was Florida Championship Wrestling, or maybe it was Southeastern. I don't know, and I don't care. He was a former leader of the Ku Klux Klan. But anyway, how does it relate to this? As many people know, in 2007, Chris Benoit murdered his family and himself. And, people that worked with Chris Benoit liked Chris Benoit. Fans of Chris Benoit liked Chris Benoit. They couldn't imagine that Chris Benoit would do something like this. CTE wasn't a thing that people talked about back then in 2007. So when this happened, a conspiracy theory started by this guy, John Lee Clary, developed that Kevin Sullivan actually broke into Chris Benoit's home in Fayetteville, Georgia, a suburb outside of Atlanta, and murdered both Chris, Nancy, and young Daniel. And the reason John Lee Clary gave for this was that because he'd been a former John Lee Clary had been a former KKK member turned into an evangelical Christian. The reason he gave for this was that when he worked with Kevin Sullivan back in the day, Kevin Sullivan worshiped the devil. And that Kevin Sullivan was satanic. right? And that Kevin Sullivan had revenge on his mind to murder Chris Benoit, his ex-wife Nancy Sullivan, and their child Daniel Benoit. Now, and for years, fans have been running with this conspiracy theory. Fans that are apologists of Chris Benoit. They just can't accept that Chris Benoit had the reign of an 80-year-old Alzheimer's patient due to multiple concussions. He had the diving headbutt was his finishing move, and that he actually did do these things that he's accused of. They want to blame it on Kevin Sullivan, the Kevin Sullivan conspiracy theory. And over the years, Kevin Sullivan has been asked about this, and he's just laughed it off because it's completely ridiculous. Kevin Sullivan did not kill Chris, Nancy, and Daniel Benoit. Chris Benoit did it. It's time to accept that. I know it's a hard pill to swallow because people loved Benoit. And when this happened, June 25th, 2007, it shook the wrestling world to the core. And people didn't want to believe it because Chris Benoit was such a nice guy. Chris Benoit was the perfect husband. Chris Benoit was a moral paradigm. But it's true. It happened. That's how it happened. It wasn't Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan was not an actual devil worshiper. What this guy, the former Klan member, was talking about was when he was, his wrestling gimmick, his wrestling persona in Championship Wrestling from Florida, or as the Taskmaster in WCW. Not his real life personality. Come on, this guy was delusional, and he put out this conspiracy theory, and fans have bought into it. And it's bullshit. It's bullshit, guys. Conspiracy theories like this develop because we don't want to believe the obvious. We don't want to believe like the 9/11 conspiracy theory or the JFK conspiracy theory or the conspiracy theory that the election of 2020 was stolen, right? Or even the conspiracy theory of Russian collusion. We don't want to believe the obvious, so we accept these conspiracy theories. But sometimes conspiracy theories make sense. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes, the Tuskegee experiment, they did give syphilis to African American soldiers, during that era. That's true. They proved to be true. Chemtrails proved to be true. When some of them, like this one and the moon landing conspiracy, complete nonsense that have been debunked over and over, or the belief that the earth is flat, they've been debunked. Sorry, the facts don't add up. They just are what they are. Chris Benoit murdered his family. Okay? People loved him. People said he was a great wrestler. And to me, he wasn't. I found him boring. Like I've said this over and over, and not just because he murdered his family. I found Benoit boring. The only match I liked from Benoit was Royal Rumble 2003 with Kurt Angle, and the Falls Count Anywhere match against Kevin Sullivan in '96. Other than that, Benoit was, you know what I mean? But he didn't deserve to die. Nancy Sullivan didn't deserve to die. Nancy Sullivan and the boy, Daniel, they're the real victims here. All right? They're the ones that suffered. Like Paul Heyman said, Paul Heyman had a conference, a fan conference, right? And somebody heckled out, what about your boy? What about your boy, Chris Benoit, right? And Paul Heyman, he did the same thing Kamala Harris did yesterday, Kamala Harris, to the pro-Palestinian protesters, where she shut them down, and she said, I'm speaking. But Paul Heyman took it a step further, and he was like, look, as a wrestler, he was top-notch. I was going to make him the ECW champion in '95 if he didn't leave. The original member of the Triple Threat, talking about Benoit. But 3 people died that day, and 2 didn't choose it. And he said, Chris Benoit is a motherfucker. And it's true. 3 people died that day, and 1 was a child, and 2 didn't deserve it. And the one that didn't deserve it was Nancy Benoit and Daniel Benoit. This wasn't the first incident. If this was the first incident, then yeah, Okay, maybe they did have a home invasion. Maybe Kevin Sullivan sent goons to kill, um, uh, you know, Benoit family. Okay, but it wasn't. The neighbors complained about Chris and Nancy always arguing. Read Ring of Hell if you don't believe me. Always arguing and always fighting. That Benoit was violent towards Nancy. He would beat Nancy up. You know what I mean? Like this was a reality. Like just because he was one way at work and his peers respected him. First of all, the fans' opinions don't matter because these are kayfabe personas. If you want to believe that, then you'll believe Kevin Sullivan worshiped the devil. Then, you know what I'm saying? But these are kayfabe personas. We don't really know them. We know characters of them, and sometimes the characters are close to reality, like Ric Flair, for example, or even Chris Benoit. But we don't actually know them. We know them from television. You know, we might feel like we do, but we don't. Okay. But even his coworkers that knew him personally, he goes to work one way, and at home he could be another way. So William Regal, and this puts everything to bed. All the bullshit you guys always talk about when it comes to this. William Regal, the tribute show that they aired on Raw for him right before they knew he died. Right, it was supposed to be the funeral of Vince McMahon. And because Vince McMahon had blown up in a limo, right? So they were gonna the funeral of Mr. McMahon, right? But Vince McMahon's fake death had to be renounced because somebody real just died. And they had a tribute show for him like they had for Owen Hart in '99. And William Regal or Eddie Guerrero in '05, William Regal refused to speak. Because why? William Regal was a neighbor of Chris Benoit. William Regal was known that Chris Benoit used to argue a lot with Nancy Sullivan and was violent with Nancy. So William Regal knew that this just didn't happen out the blue, that there was a history of violence, history of domestic violence of Benoit towards Nancy, of Chris Benoit towards Nancy. So to blame it on Kevin Sullivan, that's bullshit. You know, all you Benoit apologists, I'm sick of you. Benoit was a scumbag who murdered his family, and that's all he was. Whatever he did in professional wrestling, that's out the window, man. You know what I mean? It's unforgivable. I don't care. You know what I mean? That's the way I feel. You know, when you murder a child, that's no, okay? Murdering a woman, okay, you know. I mean, I don't support murdering a woman either, but I'm just saying, like, sometimes women get on your nerves and whatever. You know, you just walk away, you be a bigger man, whatever. I don't support domestic violence, but murdering a child, that's even lower. And initially, I thought that the child had Fragile X syndrome, which is a genetic disorder, but he didn't. But the fact that Benoit plowed the kid with Xanax and then puts him in a crippler crossface and is choking him to death. Benoit knew what he did is wrong. That's why he killed himself after that. So no, Kevin Sullivan didn't murder Chris Benoit and his family. Chris Benoit murdered Chris Benoit and his family. All Kevin Sullivan did was make it possible that he has a family, because if he hadn't booked his wife in an angle that way he falls in love with Chris Benoit, when she falls in love with Chris Benoit on TV, there would be no Chris Benoit and Nancy Benoit. She would probably still be married to Kevin Sullivan. Who knows? So anyway, rest in peace to Kevin Sullivan. What a genius. Man, I could listen to the guy, you know, kayfabe commentaries, and going back to the territories where he talks about his time in Florida and how much he loved Eddie Graham before Eddie Graham unalived himself in 1984, and how much Mike Graham loved him. I mean, who also unalived himself. Florida Championship Wrestling from Florida is associated with, to me, with just as many ghosts in their closet as world class. And I made a mistake. He didn't break in Gulf Coast Wrestling. He broke in initially in Montreal, but he never really did anything in Montreal. So he's just a job guy. But anyway, rest in peace, Kevin Sullivan. I always defended you in every argument with these Benoit nuts. You know, I always enjoyed your work in the ring, the Broad Street Bully matches, the gut stomp. You know, it was a simple move. And the Tree of Woes, man, the Tree of Woes was like a cool ass move. I always wanted to. And your accent, man, his accent, like no matter where Kevin Sullivan went around the country, he lived most of his years in Florida. That's where he made his home, even after he retired from wrestling. And that's where he was most over in the Florida territory. No matter how many years he spent outside of Boston in other places around the country, he never lost his Boston accent. He sounded just like JFK and RFK talking. You know, let me tell you something, brother. Hogan. Peace, guys.